Well, Steve, I look forward to a stimulating conversation on entrepreneurship and investing in public policy that supports entrepreneurs, but I know you have some opening observations.
So I want to spend a lot of time on it, but I thought I'd just kind of set a little context, maybe 5 minutes or so, in terms of the different activities, and then we can delve into them to whatever degree you want to. There are really 4 things that I think that I'm spending time on, or at least I'm happy to talk about this morning. One is some of the story about AOL and building the internet, which is a 20-year journey, and some of the lessons you learned from that. We were one of the first internet companies, started 26 years ago. It seems like a long time. It was the first internet company to go public in 1992, and it was a classic case of, it really took us about a decade before we kind of hit our stride, and then the next decade things really took off. So sort of some of the stories or some of the lessons learned are one kind of topic we can talk about. The second is what I've done more recently, the last 7, 8 years, which is Revolution, and really trying to partner with entrepreneurs, and that's where I spend most of my time. How do you help entrepreneurs build companies? And it's partly as an investor, but it's mostly really as a mentor and partner, and really particularly focusing on consumer companies that really can change the world. I mean, it's sort of I really do like kind of focusing on some of the big challenges. So a company like Zipcar that's been working for a decade now on trying to make car sharing the phenomenon, particularly in major cities, and is doing well, just went public a couple of weeks ago, is an example of that. It takes a long time to build a company like that, but in the long run you have this opportunity to build a significant franchise. Or more recently in the social commerce space, a company called Living Social we helped build, which is doing daily deals, really kind of, they and Groupon are kind of the 2 major forces in that. And it's really the beginning of a larger transition around Main Street retail and using the internet, particularly social commerce. It's quite interesting, not just what's happening with the daily deal side of it, but also what's happening with location-based offers. So that's sort of on the business side. Initially with almost 20 years with AOL and just trying to make the internet part of everyday life. And I remember coming out here many times trying to get people to pay attention to this new world. At the time, 25 years ago, most people here were focused on semiconductors and business software, and most people didn't think that the internet would ever really become a mainstream phenomenon. I think back then when we got started, only 3% of people were online, and if you wanted to get online, you had to go to the peripheral section of the computer store because it was defined as sort of a peripheral part of the computing experience. It took us a number of years to get PC companies to actually build modems in and stuff like that. So that was one thing. Then more recently, the Revolution side. The other piece of which I'm spending more time on, particularly in the last year, really gets into some of these issues around entrepreneurship generally and public policy issues in Washington. We just about 3 months ago launched in conjunction with the White House an initiative called the Startup America Partnership. You can go to a website, startupamericapartnership.org, and get some information. And it is a startup. We're just getting going. We just about 2 months ago hired a CEO. I think he's here. I haven't seen him this morning. Scott Case, who was one of the co-founders of Priceline, and then for 5 years has run Malaria No More, a very successful public-private partnership. And that's really about mobilizing resources to help entrepreneurs and really try to celebrate and accelerate entrepreneurship in this country. And that's really important because, as you know, but not everybody knows, particularly not everybody in DC knows, that entrepreneurs really are the growth engine of this country. The statistics from the Kauffman Foundation really kind of bear this out, that over the last 25 years, 40 million jobs have been created through high-growth entrepreneurship companies, which accounts for all of the net job creation in the nation. The big businesses don't really grow. Some grow, some decline. The small businesses, sort of Main Street, dry cleaners and restaurants, as aggregated are a lot of jobs, but they don't really grow. The leverage is really in the middle. So focusing on things that can unlock that potential and ensure that we really can create a lot of jobs, dealing with a 9% unemployment rate, and make sure we're doing things to continue to have this country be the leader in key markets is really important. And so that's just getting off the ground and trying to gather together corporate commitments to help entrepreneurs and do a lot of things like TiEcon in other regions around the country. There's a conference today and yesterday in Omaha called Big Omaha, and last week there's something in Nashville, next week there's something in Chicago. We're trying to really take a regional approach and really try to understand and map the entrepreneurial ecosystems in each of these different regions and figure out what it takes to kind of get to the next level. So that's important. And the final one, particularly since I live in Washington, D.C., have for more than half my life, I'm playing more of a role on public policy. I agreed to join something called the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, chaired by Jeff Immelt, and kind of lead the entrepreneurship part of that, and also co-chair another initiative, the Commerce Department, called National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So we're really trying to get people in Washington to focus on the issues that really matter to entrepreneurs, whether it be regulation or access to capital or talent issues, particularly around immigration. There's a variety of different things. I'm sure we'll get into some of them. And the hope is, even though it's very difficult to get stuff done in Washington, as you know, it's become increasingly partisan. The hope is, because of the importance of getting the economy on track, getting unemployment down, making sure that we take the right steps to make sure that America remains a leader in these key industries, that we can build bipartisan support for some action, hopefully sooner rather than later, to really fuel this sort of entrepreneurship in this nation. So with that, I'll let you ask me whatever you want to ask me.
Well, that's terrific. Let's take these subjects in the order you presented them. I don't want to spend too much time on AOL, but it was such a huge success, and it launched you into your current trajectory. So entrepreneurs have the ability to see around corners, to see
Right.
things that normal people can't see. Now, the idea of an internet-based business, when bandwidth was like sucking through a paper straw, was not obvious to a lot of people. How old were you when you started it? What year? And what was typical modem bandwidth that you could get over a telephone line?
Well, I started in 1985 with two other folks, and I think I was 26 at the time, something like that. But I became enamored with the concept of what we all know now as the internet when I was 21. I was a senior in college and read a book by Alvin Toffler called The Third Wave. Some of you may have read this, and he was viewed as sort of a futurist. He wrote, Future Shock and a bunch of things like that. But when I read this, particularly talking about an electronic cottage and interactive TV and things like that, I just knew it was going to happen. So even though most people kind of thought it was sort of this pie in the sky thing, I just really knew it. So when I graduated from college, I actually worked for a couple of years at Procter & Gamble and for a year at PepsiCo. But the whole while, I was really focused on this. And then moved in 1983, when I was 24, 25, to Washington, D.C. It's actually an interesting story of entrepreneurship. There was a great entrepreneur, Bill von Meister, started another company called The Source, and created a lot of ventures in the sort of 70s and 80s. And he came up with a product called GameLine, which was essentially, back then in 1982, almost nobody had personal computers. The Apple II had just come out, and the IBM PC had just come out, and so forth. It was still relatively small, but almost everybody had Atari video game machines. The Atari VCS with the game cartridges, like can't remember, and Asteroids and things like that. And so his idea was to basically plug a modem into that game machine, and then you could connect it to the phone line, and you could download video games. But over time, you also download stock quotes and encyclopedia stuff and email or what have you. So I thought it was a great idea. So basically, left the company I was working at to move to Washington to join this. And then Kleiner Perkins backed it. Frank Caulfield was on the board, and Hamilton Quist and the Citigroup, bunch of folks. And I remember Frank Caulfield, on the first meeting I attended, first board meeting, I looked at the sales statistic. This was Christmas, that must have been Christmas 80.
That would be the C in KPC.
Yeah, one of the founders of Kleiner Perkins Caulfield Byers, and said, you'd have thought they would have shoplifted more than that. That's how few of these things got sold at retail. So that company, as you might imagine, did not succeed. But thankfully, I and two other folks went off and started AOL in 1985. And even then, the Commodore 64 was a dominant computer. We did a partnership with Commodore called Q-Link, something with Tandy called PC-Link, something with Apple here called Apple Link Personal Edition, something with IBM called Promenade. So 5 years, we really are doing these private label services. Then about 1990, we kind of moved into doing our own brand, America Online, which obviously became AOL. But even when we went public in 1992, we'd been at it for 7 years. We had less than 200,000 customers and about 30 million of revenue. The market cap of the day we went public was $70 million. So we'd been at it for a while. It was going okay, but it was not a home run. And then 8 years later, when we merged with Time Warner, we had something like 20 million customers, $5 billion of revenue, and a market cap of $150 billion. So it was a classic case of sometimes these businesses just take a while to get traction. You have to have the patience and and perseverance. I actually worry that too many people are focused on sort of this built to flip kind of transactional, do something, work it, build it for a couple of years, sell it off to somebody, and go do the next thing. I think the big idea is really going to take a decade or more, and I think try and encourage more of that longer-term, built-to-last entrepreneurship. I think it's really important.
Well, yes, and I think some of the social network sites today have the appearance of being overnight successes. But what were 2 or 3 milestones along the way between starting it and selling it to Time Warner, where you hit that intersection in the road where if you hadn't made the right decision, you would have fallen backward? And then, what was a big mistake? What was your biggest mistake?
Well, the early years, we really didn't have much venture capital. I think over several rounds in total, we had like $5 million the first 4 years, something like that. And the big competitor at the time was a company called Prodigy, backed by IBM and Sears, and they were spending $1 billion to back that. So we knew we weren't going to win on sort of a marketing battle. We needed to figure out a better product, and so a lot of the focus really was on creating a more easy-to-use, kind of useful product with the first company to do a graphical interface and things like that. And that really helped kind of position. So I'd say the first thing was recognizing the market we thought someday would be a big market, even though it wasn't yet. The competitors that were emerging were pretty significant. We had to come up with a more kind of pragmatic strategy to be able to enter the market. And it took us 5 years essentially cobbling together these private label services with these PC manufacturers before we really were ready to launch on our own. So I think that was, in retrospect, actually not having that much capital probably was helpful, because it forced us to be really efficient and creative and so forth. And so that was key. I think in the 90s, probably the big move was recognizing that the internet was a threat and an opportunity. I should say, as context, up until 1991, I believe, it was actually illegal for a company like ours to connect to the internet. The internet at the time, in the 70s days, really built, as much, I'm sure many of you know, by the government ARPANET. It was limited to use by government institutions, educational institutions, for the first almost 20 years. So it actually was, when we launched our services in the late 80s, we had to create everything ourselves, our own technology, our own email, and so forth. It was not possible for us to connect to the internet. It was only, I think it was 1991, where it became possible, and then we started building bridges to Waze and Gopher and all these different things. And then the World Wide Web came on a couple of years later, and that's when we really knew there was this moment. And we recognized that if we could figure out a way to kind of embrace that and then extend it in ways that added unique value for consumers in terms of services that were basically providing better access to the internet faster, because we did some things with some speed, as well as some services that were not available unless you subscribed to AOL. So we positioned it even as the internet and a whole lot more. That was sort of that's really when things kind of drove forward. In terms of lessons learned, I think as we went from dozens of employees when we got started to hundreds of employees, 5, 6, 7 years later, to then thousands of employees, and particularly in the mid to late 90s, I can't remember exactly what the numbers are, but we probably were adding 1,000 employees a year and expanding globally and launching new things and acquiring Netscape and ICQ and MapQuest and all these different things. It got really complicated, and the ability to kind of keep control of that, keep people focused on the core things became more and more difficult. And we had, frankly, attracted a lot of people that really were less passionate about the business and more kind of free agents, almost mercenaries. This was the hot company in the hot category, and that wanted to join. So I've learned through that, and some of the companies I've been working with tried to make sure that they really get the hiring right and the culture right, and are able to capitalize on this growth in a way that doesn't essentially lose sort of the magic that got them there.
Well, this is a wonderful transition then to now Revolution, and you described 2 different tracks of investments you make. One is sort of a longer fuse with Zipcar. Another has a faster metabolism and Living Social. But how has your success as an entrepreneur informed how you've set up Revolution? And how would you position Revolution as opposed to, say, venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road?
Well, there's some similarity. We're in D.C., so we're more East Coast biased. There's certainly some similarities, but I think our bias is to do fewer things and spend more time with the companies than some others who have large funds and lots of people and so forth. So it really is more of a hands-on kind of thing. And we do some early stage sort of seed investing, particularly in the D.C. area, just trying to build that up as an entrepreneurial ecosystem. But our real focus actually isn't on startups. It's what we think of as speed up. So the companies that have been around for a little while and just have the potential to really accelerate in terms of their growth if they have the right resources, which is not necessarily capital. That's obviously part of it. It usually is either a network they can plug into and relationships and help building up the team. And it really is much more the hands-on role, not the writing a check role. And those are the ones that are really fun.
So it's best to have a proof of concept or a revenue stream
just in
already
terms
going?
of they're both great things, but for me personally, I'm more passionate about taking a big idea that's right now a little company and helping it become a big company. And how do you create billion-dollar companies in consumer segments that are empowering consumers in new ways, giving them more choice or control or convenience, things like that, in important aspects of their lives, and building significant kind of change the world companies in the process. Zipcar is actually, when we got involved about 5 years ago, it had been around for 5 years. The market was developing slowly, but in the whole market category of car sharing, I think at the time was something like 25 million of revenue, something like that, and maybe 50,000 people, subscribers, members using Zipcar, FlexCar, some of the other services. So it was still pretty nichey, but you could tell there's something going on there, and that in cities like Washington D.C. or New York or what have you, it made sense for people to share a car, not own a car, if it was convenient. And the interesting thing about car sharing versus car rental is the cars are parked in your neighborhood, and with your smartphone you basically can find the car that's a block away, book it, walk up to it, push a button, open it, and drive away. So it's a very convenient way to access a car for an hour or two, and that's really what drives.
So it wasn't just a car rental concept, it was really the whole ecology of mobile phones.
What I love about Zipcar, and there are other businesses like that, they really are taking the internet. So in some ways, the last 25 years was the first internet revolution. It was getting everybody online and making ubiquitous and making it mobile. And now almost everybody's online and they're using it all the time and they're carrying it with them and so forth. So kind of mission accomplished in terms of that first wave. The next wave is how do you take that and have that transform and disrupt every aspect of life? And so something like Zipcar is not possible without the ubiquity and the mobility of the internet. That's what makes it interesting. You could not have done a company like Zipcar 20 years ago because you wouldn't have the smarts in the car or the smarts in your pocket to really make it something that was truly convenient. And that's where I think in other sectors looking for ways to have that kind of impact and really usher in what I think could be the second internet revolution, the next 25 years, which is how you kind of really transform everyday life because of the internet, even if they're not quote-unquote internet businesses.
Now, there seem to be two philosophical approaches to investing in startups that you see on Sand Hill Road. One, let's say, is the Kleiner-Perkins approach, where that is probably more typical. You hear more venture capitalists echo this line, that they invest in people. Give me a team, and they can take a B product and a B market, make something of it. The other is represented by Sequoia Capital, is give me that explosive market, and we'll find the right team. Which do you subscribe to one or the other, or a hybrid?
Well, there's probably a hybrid, but I probably lean towards the second model. We have a bias towards investing in ideas, and some of them, like AOL, it was like a 10-year in the making overnight sensation. There are a lot of kind of curves or curveballs and different angles and so forth. But we kept focused on that idea. And so obviously, if you don't have the right team, you're not going to get anywhere. Thomas Edison had a great line 100 years ago: "Vision without execution is hallucination." So you got to have a good idea. You got to have a good vision, but you also have a team that can execute. So clearly, it's a hybrid. But we're willing to take a bet on an idea that we think at some point, and some of these ideas we focus on, like AOL or Zipcar, may take 10 years. So it's a longer term, more patient kind of perseverance model as opposed to kind of a quick model. Now there are examples of something where you really bet on the people, and Living Social actually is more like that, which is more recent. 3 or 4 years ago, some folks worked with me at Revolution Health. You wanted to go start a company basically focused on Facebook apps. This is when Facebook opened up its platform for third-party apps, and they said, this is kind of interesting, social apps, viral apps, you can build some interesting things. You want to go start a company, so provided some of the kind of seed capital to get them going. And to their credit, they were able to launch things like Pick Your Five and Visual Bookshelf and a bunch of other things. And after a year, they were the #1 Facebook apps company. They had 85 million people using their apps, but they didn't have a real path towards monetization. And that's when they kind of pivoted and really embraced the idea of social commerce and daily deals, and have gone from, when they started, it was 4 people. I think 18 months ago, it was probably 30 people. Today, it's over 1,500 people. It's really on a kind of a tear, because they really capitalized on this idea. So that actually, we didn't invest in the idea of social commerce. We invested really in the idea of a team focused on social apps, and it ended up evolving into social commerce. So I think there are examples on both sides, but I'd say I have a little bit more of a bias, maybe it's 60-40 towards betting on the idea as opposed to betting on the team.
Now, oftentimes a great startup team is not the team that can speed it up, and let alone get to, say, 500 million or $1 billion in revenue, let alone get to some kind of profitable exit for the investors. What have you noted? How do you analyze this, and how do you assess whether a startup CEO is one that can go the distance through the speed-up phase to something more?
Well, I think it's 2 things, and it is hard, and it's a lot try, and not everybody succeeds. I think there's 2 things that seem to be common. One is there's a certain maturity, even if they're in their 20s. And Tim O'Shaughnessy of Living Social, a good example, he's 29, but there's you could sort of tell he's kind of taking a long-term view and has thought through some of these issues in a thoughtful, mature way. And so there's one, that aspect, and there's a certain degree of discipline in terms of how he's thinking about scaling a company and culture and partnerships and things like that. The other, which is how you kind of determine whether your instinct that this is somebody who can kind of get to the finish line, is watching how they execute against that, and that's mostly about people. Do they recognize they need to bring in the right people sooner rather than later, and they need to overhire and really bring in terrific people that some might see as even threats, but they recognize that unless they're able to assemble their own dream team, that they're not going to get there. And then be able to also make the course corrections, because these companies, particularly when they're on a hyper growth tear, the challenges do change. That you have to change things out in your team every year or two. It's like many things, sports teams or what have you, that sometimes even great players need to be moved into a different position, and you have to change the dynamic or change the coach or change something. And constantly looking at that, I think, makes sense. I remember when AOL was in this growth phase, I spent most of my time on people issues. I just recruiting talent and trying to make sure people were kind of organized in the right kind of way. And it was hard, as I said. It was sort of a struggle. I don't think in retrospect I did as good a job as I wish I had, because that really is the kind of the essence of it. But in terms of your question, it's some mix of perspective, maturity, but being willing to bring in a team a little bit before you think you need them, and bring them in a little more experience than you think, even though some might view that as a threat, and then make adjustments over time depending on the needs of the business, the needs of the team, or what have you. So it's less about what they do, and it's more about how they think and how they lead.
Well, before we move to questions about Startup America and public policy that encourages entrepreneurship and immigration and all of those things that have historically made America a great place to start a business, but seemingly which we're kind of forgetting now. What are you most excited about from this point forward at Revolution? What kinds of business ideas and business models and business plans are really getting you jazzed up?
Well, again, my personal passion is around the consumer side, so I don't look at anything in enterprise or clean tech or a lot of things that are great industries that are actually very important for our country, but personally not something passionate about or figure I could add much value to. So that's the the caveat. I think this whole area of local is really, we're early days in terms of what's possible. Social commerce, early days in terms of what's possible. The advent of really a sharing economy, things like Zipcar, another company we're involved in called Exclusive Resorts. I think there's a whole generational shift away from owning stuff to sharing stuff, and that's going to lead to a lot of different opportunities. I think healthcare is going to be transformed with technology and consumers getting more engaged in managing their health. So there's just a variety of different things that are interesting to watch.
Well, good. Let's switch and talk about Startup America. If you can tell people in the audience what's the motivating force there.
Well, I kind of said at the beginning, the core here is that trying to get our nation, and particularly people in DC, but more broadly, to recognize and the importance of entrepreneurship as the economic and job creation engine that has propelled us for 200 years and will propel us, has to propel us in the future. You all know that because you're sitting in Silicon Valley, which most people in the world think of America as the beacon of innovation and entrepreneurship, and Silicon Valley as the epicenter of that within the United States. And I know you have your own challenges building businesses, why you come to conferences like this and learn things and network and so forth. But to the extent you think you have those challenges, if you travel around other parts of this country and regions that are really second or third tier in terms of entrepreneurial ecosystems, it's much more difficult. And there are many countries around the world that really don't celebrate risk-taking, don't celebrate entrepreneurship.
So if every place looked like Silicon Valley, there would be no need for Startup America.
Totally. If every place looked like Silicon Valley, there would be no need for Startup America. That's a fair statement. But and I'm not saying Silicon Valley is perfect, and there's still things that can be done, and conferences like this I think are terrific. But this is a pretty robust entrepreneurial ecosystem. If you go to Cleveland, in February, the president spent the day. And the Secretary of Treasury was there, and Secretary of Labor, and Secretary of Commerce, and Secretary of Energy, and the head of Small Business Administration. I was there for Startup America, and basically that's an example of a city it's on the move. It's done some interesting things in terms of connecting things together and trying to build more of an ecosystem, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and there are many other areas.
Well, they have
Detroit.
some venture capital. They have a pretty good healthcare infrastructure with
and they're building on it. So I'd put them in sort of the rising tier. A city like Detroit. I can't remember the last statistic, but they've lost something like 40% of their employment, of their population over the past half a century. So the early part of the century, they really were in some ways the Silicon Valley of America because of the importance of cars and and Ford and General Motors and so forth, really being kind of the epicenter of innovation. And that's no longer the case. How do you rebuild that? And in some of these other regions around the country, how do you build that as well? So Startup America starts with trying to celebrate and accelerate entrepreneurship. Some of that comes from getting corporate commitments to help make it a little bit easier for entrepreneurs to get their companies started, and also to deal with this speed up phase. And we started trying to collect some of those resources. But a lot is what you do at this regional level. How do you identify a healthy ecosystem, and how do you get people to learn from that? And then what can you do or help these regions do to kind of take their region to the next level?
And what's the biggest mental, or what are the barriers? I mean, some places have fine universities, but they're just can't really get all that great IP out of the university into the marketplace. Some places lack for access to capital, and some just simply look very dimly at failure. They're not as accepting of immigrant cultures. I mean, as you travel around, you see these. I mean, you really do appreciate that Silicon Valley has all those things on the positive side of the ledger, but what do you run into?
It's those issues and others, and I think the key thing is, like many things, it's not one size fits all. It's not sort of a glib response. There's 8 or 10 factors I think really will help define an entrepreneurial ecosystem. One of the things we're working on is really trying to create some methodology around that, and then really rank communities and try to figure out what can they do in terms of move the needle. There are many that have great at university, a culture of risk-taking some capital, not as much as they need, but still have trouble. And I was in last month in North Carolina, the Research Triangle area. One of the things they'll tell you, or at least told me, was when interesting companies are growing, getting people to move there is challenging because the sense is, obviously, many companies don't succeed. If you move there, move your family there, and it doesn't work out, like what's plan B? If you're here and that, there's sort of some company doesn't work out, there's some other company. That's not true in a lot of regions, and that then makes it more difficult to attract the talent you need to really fuel these, this growth. So building a broader ecosystem where there are more companies and there is more connectedness between the companies and within the community, so people have a sense of there's more of a matrix approach, and they're not betting on one particular company, and to the extent it ends up not succeeding or their role doesn't end up, kind of being a, kind of a permanent role, they're not stuck there trying to figure out what they do next.
What do you see as some of the rising entrepreneurial spots in the country?
Well, actually, one of them, D.C., which is where I live, is showing some good signs of life. Austin, obviously, is Denver. The Boulder, Denver-Boulder area is showing great momentum. Even last week, Scott Case, CEO of Star America, was in Tennessee, and there's some interesting things happening in that market. Research Triangle actually is also showing some momentum. New York City, particularly in terms of digital media and sort of leaner startups and so forth, has done well. Chicago, there's an event next week in Chicago.
And the Bostons and Seattles can kind of take care of themselves.
Yeah, Boston, Silicon Valley kind of can take care of itself. Not to say there aren't ways to continue to improve on things, but it's pretty well. If you rank them, it's sort of the top. Boston, Route 128 area is sort of number 2. Then it drops in terms of the next year, but that's really what we're trying to do, is figure out how to get this sort of what's talked about, like Thomas Friedman's book, the Rise of the Rest, and is how do you do the rise of the rest around entrepreneurial regions, so that we can kind of close the gap between the kind of the winning regions and sort of the ones that still need some work.
Yeah, because this economy is incredibly uneven right now, and it's uneven by industry, and it's particularly uneven by region. In addition to the kind of studying and ranking that you do, are there specific things that Startup America is doing that could help people in the audience, tools and resources?
Again, we just got started a few months ago, so we're in the process of putting it together. But if you look at our site, a number of companies have made different commitments to try to make it a little easier for entrepreneurs to start and scale companies. We're in the process of working to kind of put a little methodology around that in terms of essentially what companies fall into what grouping. Is it really a pure startup? Is it more kind of in sort of the early stage of ramp up? Is it really being, kind of moving into this potentially hyper growth speed up stage? And what resources can we marry to each of those categories? And not just in terms of services, but help in terms of talent or help in terms of customers or what have you. So it's the early days, and when we launched it 3 months ago, it was a classic lean startup. There was 0 employees. It was really an idea, and we were starting to assemble the team and starting to assemble the partnerships. I think we're making good progress, and I've been gratified that people really have said, it's great that they were trying to focus on entrepreneurs and celebrate their work and provide resources to them, but also educate people around the importance of entrepreneurship. And then a lot of what we hear, and we had a meeting yesterday at Stanford Law School, was sponsored by a Small Business Administration called Reducing Barriers, and the head of the FDA was there, and somebody from the Patent Office was there, and somebody from the White House was there, and just kind of talking about some of the things that are being proposed, but also just listening. There have been 8 of these around the nation the last couple of months, and it's trying to get some feedback, which then will feed into the policy process. And as I said at the beginning, it's not a getting anything done in Washington right now is challenging, but hopefully this is a good time. If we can prioritize the key things that can move the needle, we can get some bipartisan traction, because the economy does matter, jobs does matter, and we need to get moving.
Let's talk about public policy as the last of the four threads. And if you look at a similarly bad decade in American economic history, the 1970s certainly fit that bill. The 73-74 recession was comparable to the one we just went through in terms of stock market damage to national confidence, damage to political institutions. I mean, let us not forget we had a vice president and a president resigning in disgrace during that decade. And yet we had startups just cursory look at some of the startups of that decade: Federal Express in 1970, Southwest Airlines 71, Microsoft 75, Apple 76, Genentech 76, Oracle 77. So on the one hand, these very uncertain economic times seem to produce entrepreneurship that then in the following decades gets to a point where it really lifts the whole economy. But was the 70s an accident? I mean, are we going to get so lucky again, or do we, as national policy, do we really need to make sure that we learn those lessons and use this time of entrepreneurship to lift the whole country?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I mean, the good news here is that if you statistically, the Kauffman Foundation did some research, and over half of the Fortune 500 companies were started in a bear market or some recession environment. So there's clear evidence that in these difficult times, the seeds of greatness can kind of start kind of being developed. And the other aspect of that, and again, it's a good news, bad news thing, is when people lose their job or are having trouble finding a job, that actually sometimes it's a problem, and we need to, we're trying to focus on creating more jobs and creating more opportunity. But there is a little bit of a side benefit, at least for a subset of them, which is they're out of their comfort zone and they're more willing to take risks than they might have otherwise been able to do. And sometimes that leads to entrepreneurial things. Either they do or they partner with other people do. But if they're sitting happily in some office in some company and things are on track and they kind of like it, maybe don't love, but kind of like the job, and got some benefits and so forth, and they're raising kids, and there's a lot of different things. A lot of people just want to stay on that track. When they're forced out of that, sometimes they end up doing some things that are entrepreneurial. So those are positive. Not great. You're not saying, well, unemployment's good because it creates entrepreneurship, or recessions are good. How do you create environments for recessions to create more? These companies, they're bad problems, but there's some good that can come out of those bad problems. But the second part, I'd say, is we can't rest on our laurels. I mean, this is a global market, as you all know, in terms of talent and ideas and technology and so forth, and we need to kind of up our game in terms of what we do to position America as really the magnet for the best and brightest people, and the place to build great companies, whether it be technology company or services company or manufacturing companies, and having that broader kind of sector focus, I think, is important. And one of the key issues I'm really quite passionate on is the immigration issue. I'm a big believer that it's insane that we attract people here to great universities like Stanford or others, give them a PhD, and then all too often send them away to start a company somewhere else. I've been pushing hard for things like a startup visa, stapling a green card to diplomas for PhDs and master's students. And actually, I was at a meeting with the White House a few weeks ago with the president convened a group to talk about immigration. I said, Mr. President, I actually think you also should couple that stapling the green card with a letter you send to everybody saying, please stay here and please innovate here. We really want to be that magnet for talent, and we need you to work. We don't want to educate you, have you here and leave to go start things other places. We need you to stay here and build those companies in this country. So fixing that is very important, and it's complicated, and there's a debate around, should you push for comprehensive immigration reform, try to solve all the problems at once, or do you peel off some of these kind of economic job competitiveness issues and deal with them separately? I'm a fan of dealing with them separately, but we'll see how this plays out.
You have President Obama's ear. Would you say that he gets the linkage between robust entrepreneurship and economic growth and good employment? And number two, in addition to immigration reform, particularly skills-based immigration, what are 5 or 6 other things that you would, if you had a quiet hour with President Obama and the leaders in Congress, would you say these are the things that we need to do to move the lever of entrepreneurship, which is the mighty lever that will move the whole economy?
Well, I should first of all say I'm not particularly political, even though I live in Washington, D.C., so I don't really think of myself as a Democrat or a Republican. I think of myself as an entrepreneur, and so it's like I'm part of the entrepreneur party, so I really care about those issues. There are a million things going on. I'm really focused just on...
A friend of mine who edited a libertarian magazine once said there are 2 parties in the United States, the party of the future and the party of the past.
Okay, well, I want to be part of the future. So I approach these issues with a deliberately bipartisan approach. So I'm not here, I'm a volunteer in this, entrepreneur's army. No particular role with the White House. I'm not speaking, for the White House. I'm not defending them or promoting, particular, policies. I'm really focused on entrepreneurship and building bipartisan support and momentum around these issues. That said, I do think the president gets the linkage between, the importance of getting entrepreneurship right and job creation and economy and global competitiveness. That's not to say there aren't challenging political realities to deal with in an increasingly partisan environment, and things like this debate on immigration reform are example of that. Does it make sense to try to get this, kind of the half a loaf, focusing on the economic issues around high-skilled immigration, or do you go for the whole shebang? Those are complicated issues, so we might have some different views in terms of how to kind of deal with that, but there's no question that there's a recognition of the importance of this. And I think, action, speaks louder than words. And I know he's spending a lot of time on it, and this Jobs Council that Jeff Immelt created, I think, is focusing on that as well. So in terms of the specifics, immigration is a big one. I think regulation is a big one. There's some broad issues, but particularly issues around the FDA and trying to figure out how to accelerate innovation so that the cost of developing devices and drugs can be lower. Otherwise, we're going to see a big swishing sound as most of that innovation happens in other countries that have lower barriers and can essentially get things approved more quickly. There's a whole slew of issues around access to capital, and we've identified 8 different things that will be announced in the next, I think, month or so, whether it be early stage access in terms of incentives around seed and angel capital and crowdsourcing and so forth. What are different ways to provide sort of mezzanine financing in smarter ways, and how do you deal with the public markets, both the secondary market issue more broadly, which is, I think, a good thing, and IPOs and some tiering around this, so that essentially if you're a company that just goes public and has, I don't know, 10 million of revenue, you don't have the same policies that if, IBM has with 100 billion of revenue. Right now it's kind of too one-size-fits-all, so I think some tiering of that makes sense. At the core also is education, and the whole issue of STEM, and how do you do a better job in our schools, but also attract and keep talent. Ties in with education. But I would also add on top of that, which is why things like TiE are important, why I'm happy to be here. There's this broader need to essentially celebrate entrepreneurship. And really, as I said at the very beginning, recognize the reason we are a great nation and an economic power and a source of pride and so forth is because of a history of taking risks and building great industries and great companies here. And how do we not rest on our laurels, but kind of take that to another level and appreciate the role of entrepreneurs. I've said many times to folks, the White House and others, that we really should treat entrepreneurs as American heroes, and that they really are the people that are out there taking risks and really building, trying to build. Obviously, many fail, but some break through and succeed. They really are the engines of America and the source of innovation and pride and economic vibrancy and security and so forth. So let's recognize that and celebrate that, make their lives a little bit easier, which is what Startup America Partnership is trying to do, and get the policy framework in place to just shift the odds in favor of entrepreneurs and building companies here. And these are complicated issues, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. But I'm optimistic that people are beginning to understand the importance of getting this right and paying attention to it, and hopefully in the months and years to come, we'll see some positive progress.
Well, regrettably, we are out of time, so let's give Steve a big hand.
Thank you. Good luck with all your companies.